fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Now we have Mark Shaw, author, and he's the one that wrote the book. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, Mark, it's good to have you here. What brought you to write this book, first of all? Like, what led you to Dorothy?
Yeah. Well, and probably like a lot of your listeners out there who remember her from What's My Line, CBS show on Sunday nights for 15 years or so. 20 million people watched that show. Some people call it an intelligent game show. They guess people's occupations, and Dorothy was a featured panelist on that show, along with Arlene Francis and Bennett Cerf, who co-founded Random House. John Daly was the host. That's how I remembered her. And so I was rather shocked, frankly, when this was the third book in kind of a trilogy about the JFK assassination, and I never intended to write this book because I didn't know about a certain part of Kilgallen's life. But while I was researching a book about Melvin Belli, who I practiced law with a little bit in the 1980s in San Francisco, I was talking to people that would tell me about Belli and so on and so forth, and there was a doctor in San Diego I interviewed, and we were going along, and then he said, Belli knew Dorothy Kilgallen. And I said, well, from What's My Line? He said, oh, no, Mark, there was another side to her. She was this crack investigative reporter who covered the Dr. Sam Shepard case that became the Fugitive film. She covered the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case, and she covered the Jack Ruby trial. And I said, well, I didn't know that. And he said, yeah, it's interesting, Mark. When she died, I was talking to Mel, and he said, my gosh, she said, that's sad. They've killed Dorothy. Now they'll go after Ruby. They've killed Dorothy, now they'll go after Ruby. Well, that raised a red flag for me, and I wondered what that was all about. But I didn't write about it too much in that book. Then I wrote a second book about following. Belli had an affection for the Mafia. One of his main clients was Mickey Cohen. I wondered about his representation of Jack Ruby. The next book was called The Poisoned Patriarch. I took that back to Joe Kennedy's double cross of the Mafia that we can talk about. And so I was done, but I couldn't get that quote out of my mind. And so I started to look into Dorothy's story.
It's amazing how the simplest little thing can send you in a completely different direction, isn't it?
It is, and you guys are curious guys, and you hear something like that, you just think, well, gosh, I got to look into that. And it took me on roads that I never thought I would travel. I felt like Dorothy was kind of leading me along toward evidence that I needed, and I can explain that to you. But yeah, that's what happens. You open the door, and boy, it's amazing what you end up finding.
Well, maybe let's tell people exactly a little bit about Dorothy Kilgallen. I don't think a lot of people know her, maybe other than What's My Line.
Yeah, and what's been most interesting about the book, it's been amazing in some ways. Out 2 months and in its fifth printing, and 100 and some reviews up on Amazon. In fact, Amazon's run out of books again, and so people can't get it right away. There is the Kindle and the audio book, but people have been fascinated to learn about a side of Dorothy Kilgallen that they never knew about, because they had this image of her. And you have to go back and think, guys, about the atmosphere in the late 1950s and 60s. There wasn't the Internet, of course. There was the infancy of television. So where did people get their news? Well, they got it from newspapers, and they read the newspaper every day. And Dorothy was syndicated through the New York Journal American, her paper in New York, to 200 newspapers across the country. I mean, every day people read Dorothy Kilgallen's column. And then she was the crack investigative reporter that I talked about. She had a radio show every morning in New York City for 2 hours with her husband. And all this time, you know, she raised 3 kids. I mean, a remarkable woman, unparalleled in the history of media. Oprah, Diane Sawyer, they couldn't touch her. And so people respected Dorothy. She had an affection for the truth, and she was bigger than life back then. As I said, the New York Post called her the most powerful female voice in America. Ernest Hemingway said she was the greatest female writer in the world. So she was at the top of her game then. And these days, what's fascinating is that What's My Line reruns are all over the internet, and so many young people have written me who've read the book and are inspired in some ways by what Dorothy was able to accomplish, especially young women and especially young women journalists.
Yeah, I was pretty impressed by her resume. What are some of the biggest stories she did? Do you think what would have been the biggest stories before Jack Ruby?
Well, before Jack Ruby, I think would be Dr. Sam Shepard, and that's the one that most people would be familiar with. There's a great photograph up on, I want to mention the site, the Dorothy Kilgallen Story.org. We have a book site that I'll mention, but the Dorothy Kilgallen Story.org is packed with Dorothy. Photographs, quotes, all of her columns and articles, and all of these videotaped interviews that I can talk about in a little bit that are primary sources of what was happening in Dorothy's life. But there's one photograph there where she's standing in the courtroom at the Dr. Sam Shepard case, and all the reporters are hovered around her. I mean, she was the celebrity then. Judges would call her in to get an autograph before the trial happened. And, it was interesting. You talk about the power that she had. People may remember Dr. Sam Shepard was actually convicted of killing his wife in a sensational type of a murder case. And Dorothy was able, during the trial, she met the judge, and when she walked into his chambers, he said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Well, this is a perfect case for me to cover. It has sex, it has violence, it has all this." And he said, "Well, Dorothy, the guy's guilty as hell." And she said, "Well, I'm still going to cover the case." Well, she got that comment, and then Shepard was convicted. And then she didn't tell anybody about it until the judge died. She hid the source about the comment until she ran into F. Lee Bailey, the famous lawyer who was appealing Shepard's case. And she told him what the judge had said. And they appealed the case basically on what Kilgallen said about what the judge said. That case was overturned by the Supreme Court, and Bailey attributes its overturning to Dorothy Kilgallen, the power that she had and her credibility as a reporter in saying what the judge did. So that's an indication, isn't it, of the power that she had at that time.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. She was right up there. Now, and that was very unusual for a woman back in the 60s as well. It just seemed to be a different type. She had a different agenda in a way.
Well, we say still, unfortunately, there's that feeling the women should be in the back seat. Well, back then they were back behind the car because they were thought to be somebody that should, never ask questions, just kind of be complacent, be the mother in the home. And I'm not saying those are bad things, but that was how it was looked upon. And she was a college dropout at 17. She begged her father, who was a noted, gifted journalist, to take her to the Journal-American offices. She loved that. She dropped out of college. She started writing her articles, and within a few years, this slender woman who was this great, wore the fashions of the day and all of that, had ingratiated herself with the other male reporters and become just as respected as any reporter at that time. And then, of course, when she became a panelist on What's My Line, that just elevated her stardom.
I think that put her more in the public attention.
Oh, yeah, because that show was huge at the time. I don't know what you'd compare it to now, but there were only the 3 stations, or maybe there was only 2 at that point. But for 20 million people to watch that show on Sunday nights, that made her a celebrity. And that gave her, along with her credibility as a reporter, that gave her the bully pulpit. That gave her the credibility. She had the best sources. And you'll see how important that is when we get to talking about the JFK assassination, because people trusted Dorothy. And it was interesting, guys, that she could straddle that fence between being a game show panelist celebrity and being a respected journalist, which couldn't have been easy at the time, but she was able to do that.
If we had to compare with somebody today, I would have to compare her with Leah Remini. You know, she was known as a very popular, co-star in a comedy show, which gave her the public attention, and now she's reporting on the Church of Scientology.
Good point. Good point. There you have somebody else that's been able to, elevate their credibility somehow or another, despite having a background that would make people wonder about whether, they ought to pay attention to them. That's an excellent example.
Let's set up her life a little bit. So before she got on to Jack Ruby and the JFK assassination, what was her situation? Paint the picture of where she lived, her family.
Well, Dorothy, they lived on East 68th Street in New York City in Manhattan, a few blocks away from the Russian embassy that was right in that area and all of that. And she married a Broadway producer named Richard Kollmar, Kollmar. He was pretty well known. He had played Boston Blackie, the detective on radio, and he'd had some hit Broadway shows. Everything was just real chummy. On the DorothyKilgallenStory.org, you'll actually see an interview with Edward R. Murrow, who had the popular person-to-person show at the time. And she sits there with Richard in their lavish mansion townhouse, and she's there with two of the children, young Carrie and Jill, and the third one, Dickie, is off at a private school. And they're just the happiest family that you could possibly find. Now, unfortunately, Richard hit a downhill stretch. His Broadway plays didn't do well. He opened 2 or 3 restaurants that didn't do well. He started to have some alcoholic problems, and really, as I say, went downhill. And so he and Dorothy kind of went their separate ways because, as one of the hairdressers will say, she was very lonely. There wasn't any affection there. He was running around on her. And so she sought some companionship herself. The first person was Johnny Ray, who was a well-known singer at the time, the Little White Cloud That Cried and all that, known to be a homosexual, but obviously he was a bisexual because he and Kilgallen fell madly in love. That relationship ended, and as of November 1965 came along, she was in a relationship with a Columbus, Ohio journalist named Ron Pataki that we'll have to talk about because, frankly, he's the main suspect in her death. So that kind of fills you in. There was some problems in the marriage, and unfortunately, 2 to 3 years after Dorothy died, Richard died as well, and the official cause was said to be a stroke, but most people believe that he committed suicide. So it was a tough time for the kids, and they don't have a lot of great memories of the last years of their parents' life, although now, with Dorothy's story being told, I think they'll be much more proud of their mother than they ever could have been before.
Now, her relationship with Johnny Ray, she even, we were talking about her power, and just as a person in the 60s with newspapers, but she had she helped him get off because he was actually arrested. That was before it was legal to be homosexual.
Yeah, and you have to ask yourself, here was a famous celebrity like her, and you would think that in that day and age when homosexuality was a no-no, wasn't even talked about or anything, she got away with it. She went around with him in the Broadway scene and in restaurants, and they were seen drinking together and having a wonderful, wonderful time. And then, she showed her power again. He was arrested in Detroit for a homosexual act. She felt like it was unfounded. She went to the court. She was there with him, and most people believe that the acquittal of Johnny Ray was based on the celebrity status of Dorothy Kilgallen. So, that again shows her power. And I should have said, too, when she covered these trials, like Johnny's or Sam Shepard's or the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case and the Ruby case, it's just amazing to read her columns, which are on that website I mentioned, and see this gifted wordsmith. I mean, if I could write, this is my 25th book, if I could have written like she does, I'd had 25 bestsellers because she brings those trials alive. You feel like you're right there, that you're touching Sam Shepard or the Lindbergh kidnapping suspect and all of that. So people, I think, when they read the book, will get to read some of that writing about those cases, and I think they'll be absolutely amazed at the gifted wordsmith that she was.
Yeah, I found that to be one of the best parts of the book. And I don't mean that to say it was something wrong with it, but I mean it was a real highlight. The samples that you have of her writing.
Yes, and I wanted to do that. My books, I really look for the truth, and this book is warts and all. I mean, some people have criticized me for including her love affairs and things like that, but that's all part of Dorothy, and that's the part that I wanted to focus on. But I was completely committed to including in the book some of that writing acumen of hers, because it's very, very special.
Yeah, she definitely had a way with words. I agree, totally. Now, how did she... Oh, actually, we should mention that she was actually at the inauguration of Kennedy, and she was kind of friends with him, too, wasn't she?
Well, you hit a real important point in the book, and I think you and Kevin will be most interested to know about that, because Bennett Cerf said about Kilgallen, when she went after a story, nothing could stop her, and that was really true. And in this situation, she and JFK were social friends. She knew him at the Stork Club in New York City, and he had come to her home to play charades and all of that. But at one point, she took her young son Kerry, who was in the third grade at the time, to the White House. And JFK befriended Kerry. He was brought into the library, and JFK gave him a PT-109 pin for his lapel, looked at some letters that Kerry had brought from his third grade class. And so when JFK died, I won't have the exact quote, but she wrote something in her column like, what I remember is a tall man stooping over a young boy looking at his grade 3 class letters. That's the man that was assassinated in Dallas. And she took that personally, and that's what really launched this 18-month investigation that she had to find the truth out about what happened to her friend, the president.
Yeah, it was pretty intriguing. Now, she actually went to Dallas and looked around and went to Jack Ruby's trial, didn't she?
Yeah, and Dorothy right away, I think, was, as you'll read from the columns that are on that website, the DorothyKilgallenStory.org, you'll see that right away she was dubious of this Oswald alone theory. The first column she wrote was Oswald file must not close, and she went from there. She figured out right away that Oswald was a dead end. There was so much information about him conflicting and everything else that he wasn't the real key to finding out what happened. The real key was Jack Ruby. And so on the website you'll see that she ingratiated herself with the defense, Melvin Belli and Joe Tannehill. There's a video of her sitting right there with Belli and Tannehill at a press conference that they had. And then you'll see a video of Tannehill talking about her interview with Jack Ruby, how that happened, what Ruby thought of her, and where the interview took place, and whether it was a serious interview and all of that. So right away, that's where she was headed, and we don't know exactly what Ruby told her, but we do know where she headed right after she not only interviewed Ruby, but also exposed his Warren Commission testimony before it was supposed to be released. She didn't head for Washington, D.C., where the government was and the CIA and all that. She didn't go to Dallas where LBJ was. She didn't go to do any of that. She went to New Orleans, and that's where she was trying to track down evidence about Carlos Marcello, who was one of the mafioso who hated the Kennedys most. And so we know that all about her, and then we can kind of trace the steps up to when she died in 1965.
Yeah, that was. I just think that was pretty amazing, actually, being able to interview Ruby. That was a feat as well.
Well, again, you have to think of her stature, and Ruby, just had a lot of respect for her, and for whatever reason, then Tannehill set it up, and they were able to talk, and so that was a real feather in her cap, as you can imagine, at that particular time. And then when she just exploded on the front page of her newspaper, Ruby's testimony before the Warren Commission, you have to think that was probably like the exposure of the Nixon tapes, or other kind of things that could have happened in terms of exposing government secrets and things like that, because she was able to do that. And that's really when it became more of a dangerous situation for her, because there were those who did not want her to expose the truth. And that's what Dorothy was going to do.
It seemed like, to me, that there were other people, too, like Hoover, and they sort of wanted to go with Oswald as the lone killer right away, even before the Warren Commission.
Oh, you just, you can't emphasize that enough. I've come to respect J. Edgar Hoover and despise him at the same time, because he was a smart guy. When JFK was killed, there's two ways to go. One, it can possibly be a conspiracy, which means that Hoover is complicit. He's somebody who should have stopped that with his FBI and all of that kind of thing, and so he can have some responsibility. Or you go with just shouting to the world that it's this guy, this nut, who killed the president, and if that's the case, then you don't have any responsibility at all, because nobody could stop that. Well, of course, he was smart enough to know you go with the nut, and that was Lee Harvey Oswald. And so right from the beginning, he was shouting this to the world, and frankly, everybody was buying it, and he then railroaded the Warren Commission, and so everybody was looking in the wrong direction. They all looked at Oswald, and they didn't look in Ruby's direction, and that's where Dorothy differed from all of these other reporters, because she focused in on Ruby. And so, as you can imagine, that made her an enemy of Hoover. In the book, it's kind of set up as a true crime murder mystery. He's one of the suspects that I believe could have ended Kilgallen's life, and readers can make up their mind as to whether that's true or not.
Well, if I can kind of jump in to the conspiracy puddle for just a moment, we had so many conspiracies going on at the time. For example, you had the Manchurian Candidate, which they believed that Jack Ruby may have been. Did she ever get involved in that type of conspiracy?
Well, Kevin, there's been so much speculation out there, and I'm really careful to only use primary sources, people who were there, who can say what happened and all of that, and that's what a lot of these videos and other things we have in the book are there. No, I don't think Dorothy would have gone that direction. She was doing what I used to do as a former criminal defense lawyer. She was looking at motive. And I think that she discovered, first of all, that Belli's defense of Ruby was tainted. This insanity defense that he projected, not letting Ruby testify, she wondered about that. She knew about his mafia affiliations with Mickey Cohen and all these other guys, so she questioned that. Then she got into Ruby, and she thought to herself, well, wait a minute, what's the motive for Ruby killing Oswald? And she had to say to herself, look, that guy had to be silenced. This is just like a mafia hit. I mean, somebody shoots somebody, and I think Oswald was probably part of this, but then he's a loose cannon. He's a loose screw who can talk about who ordered him to do that, or who recruited him to do that. So you bring in Ruby. And then Ruby could also be somebody who could talk about this too much, so you bring in Belli, and you basically just silence Ruby by not letting him testify and making him look crazy and everything. And then that buttons up everything. Well, who has the most to gain from that? Whoever masterminded the JFK assassination. And from whatever she learned from Ruby and her own sources that she had, which were the best at the time, she honed in then on Carlos Marcello, and that's why she went to New Orleans, because, as I said, Marcello, was back against the wall. They had deported him once. They were going to deport him again, as November 63 came up. He was in a New Orleans courtroom defending himself against a racketeering charge. Well, he couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let Dorothy go ahead in my opinion, with writing this book and exposing his involvement in the JFK assassination. So he was the one with the motive who had to first of all say, I got to get rid of Jack Kennedy so Bobby Kennedy is powerless, and that's what he did. And then he decided, I can't let Dorothy Kilgallen expose me as being involved in the JFK assassination. I'm going to have to get rid of her, and I'll tell you how I think that happened in terms of silencing Kilgallen.
I have to say, she had more than just the one enemy sort of thing. Like, she also had fights with Frank Sinatra. She had her list of enemies. So how do you narrow down on which one you think it is?
Well, the way I did it was, again, to you first look at motive, and then you look at, the plausibility of what happened. I've tried, when I've talked about the JFK assassination in these three books, I've tried to be very logical, so there aren't very many layers of what happened. Joe Kennedy double-crosses the mafia. Joe Kennedy orders JFK to appoint Bobby. Bobby goes after Marcello and the other people. Well, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out that you've got to get rid of, you've got to make Bobby Kennedy powerless, and so I think that is very logical in terms of what happened there. And then you look at the Kilgallen situation, and it just fits in there. I mean, Kilgallen was 52 years old when she died. JFK was 46. In my opinion, these two deaths are completely connected. The mysteries of both of them are connected. And so the thing to do is to use some just common sense logic and say to yourself, hey, what's plausible here? And not go astray too far, as many people have done. As many JFK books have been written, many of them, most of them, there's only one, I think, that even mentions Dorothy Kilgallen. And then you narrow down the sources, the suspects. Yes, she and Frank Sinatra hated each other. She wrote some scathing columns about his girlfriends being floozies and all this other kind of stuff. He retorted by calling her a woman who didn't have a chin. In his nightclub act, he would say, let's go out and buy Dorothy a chin. Then she wrote another scathing article, so he sent a fake tombstone to her office. They did not like each other.
He called her
mentioned J. Edgar
too, didn't he?
Wow.
Yeah. We mentioned J. Edgar Hoover. He had all of the motive to get rid of Kilgallen, because if she had exposed all of her JFK assassination evidence and pointed to him as just being a bit of a cover-up in terms of what happened by shouting the Oswald theory, Lone theory, he could have been in trouble. Marcello is the other one. I also bring into the equation Dorothy's husband, because of their marital problems and her not being able to trust him, even though he knew some about the assassinations. And then the fifth one, as I say, is this Ron Pataki, the journalist who I believe was implicated in her death as well. So those are the logical suspects. I present the evidence against them. I present the forensic evidence that points to Kilgallen being killed, and then people can make up their own mind as to what they think happened.
So let's talk about that last night that she was alive. Exactly how did it go down?
Dorothy, we first first watch Mark Sinclair talk about getting her ready for that What's My Line program on November the 7th. He finds some fake flowers in the lobby. He brings them up. He puts them in a hairpiece for Dorothy. He gets her makeup and eyelashes ready. She's going to wear this flowing gown, which she was famous for when she was on the show. And then Sinclair leaves, and then we see her pop up on What's My Line. Sinclair notices she's not wearing the snazzy dress anymore. She's wearing kind of a date-type dress. She's on that program. She's sharp. She guesses the occupation of a woman who sells dynamite, who will come into play in a little bit.
Oh, wow.
She's just amazing on the show. And then afterwards, first of all, Sinclair notices the difference in the dress on the show and wonders what's going on there, and speculates that she's going to meet with Ron Pataki, this lover that she had, to confront him about the possibility that he may have been leaking some of her JFK assassination evidence to the wrong person. She goes with this producer, Bob Bach, to a P.J. Clark's tavern in New York City. We then know that she leaves there and goes to the Regency Hotel bar, which is about 6 blocks away from where she lives. Catherine Stone, who was the woman who sold dynamite, contested on the show, sees her in the corner with a mystery-type man. She can't tell who he is. They're right together, and they're talking very seriously. Our opinion is, based on the interviews with Pataki and some incriminating evidence against him, that he is the man that was there. What we know then is that she was seen there about 2 o'clock in the morning. We don't know how she got back to her townhouse, but the next morning at 9 o'clock, Mark Sinclair, in a very shocking videotaped interview, talks about finding her body, as I said, in the bedroom that she never slept in. I believe in the book I've proven that there's no question that it wasn't suicide, it wasn't accidental death, as the medical examiner concluded, but murder, and the murder weapon was barbiturates. The autopsy report said there was one. My forensic evidence through primary sources that were around at that time is that there were 3 in her system. And based on that, accidental death and suicide go out the window, and there's no question in my mind that Dorothy was in fact the reporter who knew too much, and that she was murdered.
So the official cause of death would have been drug overdose.
Yeah, and let me just ask you this, you guys. You're logical fellows, smart guys. If you read a conclusion about a person's death and it said this: a combination of barbiturates and alcohol, and then a colon, circumstances undetermined, wouldn't you want to investigate what the heck they meant by circumstances undetermined? Well, of course you would.
Right.
And yet, that didn't happen. And the reason that it didn't happen is because I believe the connection between Marcello, the gangster Frank Costello in New York, who was his best friend, Pataki being involved, and then, as I said, the Brooklyn DA's, Brooklyn Medical Examiner's office coming into this, a mafia-controlled office, it all just came together. No investigation. People bought the story. Nobody stood up for Kilgallen, her family, her friends, her colleagues on What's My Line. Journalists, nobody. They just thought themselves, well, you know, this must be what happened, and the case was closed, and that was it until now.
I want to bring that up, too. You mentioned the Brooklyn. Now, she died in Manhattan, so it wasn't really the medical examiner that should have been examined.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're being way too smart about this, Al, I'm telling you, because, and Kevin, you realize too, I mean, it made no sense whatsoever unless it was meant to be, unless it was directed, unless it was part of this whole scheme to silence Kilgallen, and then case closed. Nobody's going to ask any questions. And as I say, the killer's won here because Kilgallen's file disappeared. She's disappeared for 50 years. She's not even close to being included in any of the JFK assassination books, even though she's the most credible reporter who ever covered them. So they all won, the worst form of censorship, but by golly, through, I hope what I've been able to uncover about her, the research and the truth about what happened to Dorothy, and now this investigation by the DA, we're gonna find out what really happened back then.
And I want to talk about Bennett Cerf. Now, he was on the What's My Line show as well, but he was actually the co-founder of Random Books, right?
Random House, yeah. Random House, and he's the one that hired her to write the book about the JFK assassination. You know, he believed after she died that something was wrong, but I think they just didn't. Maybe they were scared because they knew powerful forces had gotten to Dorothy, and if they could get to Dorothy, they could get to her. The hairdressers talk about how scared they were. I just talked to a gentleman this morning who I'm going to be interviewed with on Thursday in New York City. He was telling me, he's a criminal defense lawyer. He told me he had a great friend that was worked with Dorothy, and that guy thought that she was murdered. And he said, "Well, you know, why don't you go to the police?" And the guy said, "You got to be crazy. I'm not going to get killed myself." And so there was a lot of people that were very scared about what happened. Now, Bennett Cerf should have not been one of those, but he didn't question the death. He was just one of those people who thought, well, you know, I guess Dorothy overdosed and drank too much, and so that's that. And that's really unfortunate that nobody stood up for her.
Well, was she on prescriptions from the doctor? Was she taking some sort of medication, or something, and was she known as a drinker then?
No, there's really no evidence that she had any kind of alcoholic problem. That was her husband's problem. She had a prescription for Seconal. They found an empty bottle of pills by her bed, but when they talked to the pharmacist, he told her that had been about 30 days earlier she got them, so apparently they were almost gone.
Yeah.
What they found, though, I don't want to give it away too much because I want people to make up their own mind in the book, but you will see evidence of 2 more barbiturates that were found in her system by some toxicologists at the medical examiner's office in Brooklyn. 2 years later, they had been able to save some of her bodily fluids, and they were so scared that they didn't let anybody know about that. So there was a cover-up in 63, or 65, a cover-up in 67, and nothing was done about it. But she did have that prescription, and for whatever reason, at that time, at least, they thought that might be the cause of death. But later on, it was proven that she had more barbiturates in her system. And there's a very unique aspect of that I'll leave for the readers so that they can make up their own mind as to why I believe there's no question at all, that she was murdered.
Well, you said something very key just now that I kind of honed in on. 65. And then you mentioned 67. Was there a reason to reopen the case in 67?
No, not at all. Again, in the book, I pride myself on primary sources, and I was able to track down Chris Broach, who was the son of John Broach, who was a toxicologist at the New York Medical in Brooklyn. And he said that there was another doctor there that his father worked with, Chris did, and it was Dr. Umberger, Charles Umberger, and Umberger was one of these guys who kept bodily fluids, believing that maybe the technology would get better where they could do better testing. So 2, I think it is, or 3 years later, they had kept this, and John Broach did some tests and found the evidence of these 3 barbiturates in her system. And it's most interesting because one other physician who was there at the time was Dr. Michael Baden, who became famous, for the the Jackson murder, the Jackson death, and many others. And they all concluded at that time that there was no question that Kilgallen's death was a homicide. And though the problem was that, again, they were all scared to bring that evidence forward, and it got suppressed. And so nobody knew about it until many, many years later. Chris Broach says that John Broach told him, too, at times they were asked to falsify autopsies. They were asked to manipulate evidence. They had trouble figuring out what dead body was what dead body. It was a mess in that office, and that led to all of the confusion and then the, I think, cover-up by the medical examiner's office.
Well, that leads to the obvious question. Who was doing the asking, and who was doing the threatening?
Yeah, I think what you do, again, is you watch the thread here. You watch the thread from Belli to Ruby, from Ruby to Kilgallen, Kilgallen then in New Orleans to Marcello. And if people feel like I'm right about Marcello probably being the main suspect, then you look at Ron Pataki's, he had some contacts with mafioso. He had kind of a violent background. So you could see then Marcello finding somebody like Pataki who could get into Kilgallen's inner circle and find out what she was investigating and what her conclusions were. And then you have Marcello using his best friend Frank Costello, the gangster, the Don of New York City. And, it's not hard to believe that at some particular point that Marcello decided to put the hit on Kilgallen. They used Costello, they used Pataki, and they used the medical examiner's office in Brooklyn. Kilgallen's drink, either at the Regency Hotel or at home, is spiked with these barbiturates. She's dead, and the case is closed, and that's the end of it. And so I think that's a pretty logical progression as to what could have happened to Kilgallen here.
I was going to say, I also noticed how you bring up Marilyn Monroe in the situation and how they're both ended up with similar deaths.
Yeah, people have asked me about the similarities there, and for one thing, they'll be interested in the book, and you read it, Al. Kilgallen, when Marilyn died, wrote a very, very special column about her and what a wonderful person she was and star, and how much she'd given to the world and everything. But she also questioned Marilyn's death, because Marilyn was found in a little bit of a similar situation in a bedroom, alleged to have been a drug overdose and all of that. People have asked whether there's a connection there, and again, the similarities are there with the death scene, but and I think there was some suspicious nature to Marilyn's death scene as well. But I've never been able to connect the two, or to find primary sources like the ones I have for Kilgallen's death existing regarding Marilyn's death. And so that's not something I've investigated. Other people have, and I don't know that they've come to any real conclusions as to what happened. Of course, they suspect the Kennedys and so on and so forth, but a lot of that's just speculation.
So if I'm following this thread correctly, let's go back a little further than Jack Ruby. Would it be logical, using the evidence that you have given, to connect the JFK assassination to the mob?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. Again, it's interesting. Who was it that I was reading the other day? Oh, Nancy Pelosi, of all people, in a book.
Oh, no.
You'll find this interesting. I'm not a big Nancy fan, but that's okay. But anyway, she said, hey, wait a minute. The JFK assassination was just a mafia hit. Well, it does make sense that it was. I mean, just look at what happened. You've got the motive that JFK's got to go because Bobby needs to be powerless, so he'll leave the mafia alone. And then you bring in, Lee Harvey Oswald is kind of this patsy that he said he was, and he's part of this whole thing. He gets arrested, so they got a person there, but I think what they expected probably was that he'd be killed, but he wasn't killed, so now he's a loose cannon. So now you bring in Ruby, whose mafia association is known in Dallas, and I think Dorothy connected him with Marcello. And so Ruby, anybody that believes that was a coincidence, getting into the basement at Dallas Police Headquarters needs to be in a mental hospital. I mean, it's just, you can see that was supposed to happen. He kills Oswald, so he's dead. Then they bring in the mafia lawyer, Belli, and he silences Ruby, and everything is just rosy, except for what? One reporter, Dorothy Kilgallen, the only one who was shouting that all this didn't make sense and going to write a book about it. So what do you do with her? You get rid of her as well.
You shut her up.
Sure disillusioning, because back then you'd think things were all good, and it wasn't.
Oh, but Al, look at what's going on today. Look at you guys. You're on the air. You're trying to provide the audience with the truth as to what's happened with regard to a number of things. You're putting yourself at risk. And today that is a risk. It's a risk with all journalists out there. It's a risk with radio talk show hosts. It's a risk because you're putting yourself out there, and there may be people, especially in this kind of atmosphere that we have these days with all the violence and everything, who won't agree with what you're doing. And what's the best way to shut you up? Well, that's to get rid of you. And so I don't know that things have changed a lot. It's the same situation back in Dorothy's time. And I have such respect for journalists and talk show hosts and authors who stick their neck out, because they've got to know these days that if they do, especially now, that they're putting themselves in danger.
Yeah, or they will marginalize you.
Well, throw mud at you. They can do that.
Yeah.
They can, fortunately, here's a good thing, something that really bothers me, and that's with Dorothy. There was no evidence she was an alcoholic, no evidence she was a drug addict. So you would think that people would say, wait a minute, that's not the Dorothy Kilgallen we know. But our tendency is to think the worst about people at times. If somebody said that, Al was a bank robber in his past, or he had, done some things that way, to muddy what he's saying, you would hope, Al, that people would say, well, that's not the Al that I know. He's not the guy who would run off and leave his wife and kids and do whatever it may be. You too, Kevin, if they say things about you, that's the easy way to muddy what is the truth. But it happens far too often, and it's still happening today.
Yeah, that's right. It seems to be the focus is more about what they can say negative about you than really what you're saying.
Yeah, and I've had people who have done that with me. There's one gentleman who's writing a book about about What's My Line, and he wants to, in my opinion, distort a lot of what the real truth is about Dorothy in this book that he may be writing. And I've told him, I've said, here, look at everything that my research has shown. At least tell both sides of the story, because for whatever reason you have got this attitude towards Dorothy that is so negative and wanting to bring up some things that just are not factual. But why is he doing that? He's doing that because he wants to sell books. And he thinks the sensationalism there is what will do that. And I've been begging him to reconsider and at least present both sides of the story. Now, fortunately, my book is out there, and there's almost 10,000 of them out there now, so hopefully if that book comes out, people will stop and think a little bit. But this is what happens, and there are those people who think I should have left this alone, I shouldn't have gotten into Dorothy's story, and have asked whether I've been threatened and things like that. Well, I don't like to get into that, but that's going to happen any time that you're trying to tell the truth about something.
Oh, yeah.
Well, what is the threat today? I mean, if people are warning you to stay away from this story, don't get into this, what is the threat today? I mean, it's 2017.
Well, you just can't tell with people. I've gotten some very strange emails and people who just believe that, hey, we're getting back into this JFK assassination, and it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and you shouldn't be looking in any other direction. It just confuses the American people with what you're reporting. I mean, it's those kinds of objections to, people have read the book and just said, and for the most part, 95% people have been very much in support of what I've written and the investigation and everything else, but there are those people who want to say, this is not something you should have touched. This is something you should have left alone. And you're just, you're wrong about these things, and you're confusing people about what happened with the JFK assassination. It was Lee Harvey Oswald, and that's the end of it. Stop what you're doing. Well, I'm not going to stop what I'm doing, but I try to understand what they're saying and try to reason with them. But I've had some people that don't want to hear that. That's for sure.
Wow. Even to this day.
Even to this day. The two hairdressers, one of them interviewed in 2005, the interviewer asked him, why didn't you come forward? And he said he was scared. And the interviewer then says, well, are you scared now? And he says, yes. That's in 2005.
He even mentioned that she wanted to get a gun.
Yeah, he did, and I think that's very credible. She changed her will. She was worried about her son Kerry being kidnapped. She knew she was in danger, but I think she thought she was invincible, that nobody could touch her. And and I don't want to take credit for this because it's not right to do so. I was in an interview the other day, and one of the hosts of the show said, well, have you considered the fact that those people that were involved in the JFK assassination, they didn't want any more written about all this. And there were some other journalists who were on the fringes who were looking into it a bit as well, not as much as Dorothy. But they said, what you could do here if you wanted to? You get rid of Dorothy Kilgallen, the most powerful female voice in America and this big celebrity, and it's a warning to every other journalist to stop any investigation that they have. And that has some credibility to it.
Yes.
Well, this is just so interesting, and we're already out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap this up. But
Sure.
This has been a great interview. Our guest has been Mark Shaw. The book is The Reporter Who Knew Too Much. Thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Al. And if it's okay, if there's some updates on the on the DA investigation, I'll come back and give you that update.
Oh, we'd love it.
That would be great.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.